Hello, everybody. My name is Chi Weang. I'm the Executive Director at Equal Voice. Welcome to the Importance of Representation in Governments, a conversation being hosted by EGAL and Equal Voice. We're really delighted to have you with us today. I want to start by acknowledging that I live and work on the lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, Chippewa, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat people here in Toronto. I'm the Executive Director at Equal Voice. We're Canada's only multi-partisan organization that's focused on electing more women to all levels of government through educational opportunities. We help to get women elected. We support them through systemic change and help keep them in politics. Our partner organization with us today is EGAL. They are the lead on the 50/30 program. They are Canada's leading organization for 2S LGBTQI people and issues. They work to save lives and improve research that improve the lives of those communities through research, education, awareness, and by advocating for human rights and equality in Canada and around the world. EGAL is one of the 5 ecosystem partner organizations selected to support the 50/30 challenge participants by helping them become more responsive to their diversity and inclusion needs. We're really delighted to have you join us today for this conversation. I'm joined today by the Honorable Julie Green. I will introduce her in a moment, but just want to share that this is part of a series of learning conversations being hosted by EGAL and their ecosystem partners. And we love for this to be a bit of an interactive session. So we all have been living through Zoom life. You're welcome to use the chat to ping participants, and to ping the participants and the hosts. You can also use the features to react and interact that way. Il y a aussi la capacité d'avoir la traduction en français. You can use the interpretation at the bottom of the Zoom interface. There's a globe icon that you can hit for that. So let's get started. We are really delighted to have Minister Julie Green with us. We're going to share her bio in the chat, but Minister Green, someone who has been elected and holding office for a number of years now. We'd love for you to start by sharing your story with us, Minister Green. Why did you decide to take office and what was the reason that pulled you into politics?
Well, thank you for the introduction, Chi, and good afternoon, everyone from Chief Dry Geese Territory, which is the home of the Yellowknives Dene and the North Slave Métis Alliance. I grew up in a family where the union had a really prominent role. My dad was a unionized worker, and social justice came along with that, of course. And so that has always been part of my life, but maybe never more so than when I started to campaign for equality rights for gays and lesbians about 20 or 25 years ago. That was really an important issue for me as a lesbian. It was important to the community that I belong to, and I'm happy to be associated again with EGAL. They were key partners in our relationship in advocacy in the Northwest Territories to obtain equality rights. So from there, although I did work for the CBC for a long time and it was harder to have a public advocacy role, once I left the CBC, I joined the YWCA and did a lot of advocacy around housing and poverty on behalf of the YWCA, and got kind of frustrated with where I was at and decided I needed to sit at a bigger table. And so I ran in the 2015 election, and I was elected to represent Yellowknife Centre, which is downtown Yellowknife, population about 20,000 people. And then I ran again in 2019, representing the same constituency. So it's important to my remarks to you today, Chi, just to talk a little bit about consensus government. So we are a system without political parties. Each person decides for him or herself that they want to run in the election. They create their own platform. They fund their own campaigns, and they get elected or not. 19 members comprise the Legislative Assembly, and once we have been elected, then among us we choose a premier. And from there, we choose 6 members of the executive council. And so people run for those positions, premier and executive council. They make speeches in the Legislative Assembly and answer questions about why they think they would be good as a minister. And so ultimately 6 people are chosen for the executive council, and the premier assigns the portfolios. So it's a sign of the collaboration that has been part of the 19th Assembly, that the premier wanted us to indicate which portfolios we wanted, and then she assigned them according to our wishes mostly. So that's the short story of where I'm at today, nearing the end of the 19th Assembly and my political career, and looking forward to whatever happens next.
Thanks, Minister Green. I should have also opened up with the top to kind of lay the groundwork of this conversation. You know, across the country, we have a whole range of representation in terms of gender diversity in our political houses. Northwest Territories was the very first to achieve that gender parity milestone. And so, you know, when we think about the 50-30 work and the goals of the 50-30 initiative, which are to see more women in leadership roles and on boards, as well as the representation of diverse groups at that 30% number, we thought this would be an amazing conversation to have, especially as we haven't really reached that benchmark anywhere else. And so, you know, part of the question for us in this conversation is to really dig in and to explore a little bit about how the North, how Yellowknife and the Northwest Territories really achieved this particular round of success. I'll also mention that the rest of the country is following closely, because we have work to do. In our House of Commons, we're at 30%, which is a bump from where we were 15 years ago, but there's still progress to be made, and we want to make sure that federally and in other provincial legislatures and territorial legislatures that we're drawing from some of the wisdom and the experience there, and applying it, you know, the same standards that we're asking from our communities and our corporations and organizations, and bringing that lens back to political office. So let's dig into the Northwest Territories success story. Minister Green, can you tell us about you know, how you went from to achieve your gender parity and the situation that you're in today in 2023, and where that path, how that path evolved?
Yeah, thank you for setting that context. Yes, so in 2015, just 2 women were elected among 19 members, myself and the woman who is now the premier. And you know, only she was elected to cabinet, and the fact that she was elected to cabinet meant that our minister responsible for gender parity and women's issues for the first time in many years was in fact a woman, and this was not a portfolio taken on by the male premier. So we were obviously at a very low ebb, and over the years that the Assembly has existed, there had been either 2 or 3 women elected out of 19 each assembly. So it was a pitiful representation, amounting to maybe about 10 to 12% of the population of MLAs. So knowing that this was an issue, the clerk of the Legislative Assembly and the Speaker of the Legislative Assembly shared with me some information they'd obtained at the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association meeting of, I'm going to say maybe 2015. And what they shared was an example from the Pacific Islands, where women were not represented at all. And there was a joint project of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association and the United Nations Development Agency to increase women's representation there. So just briefly, what they decided to do was to set a quota for women's representation. And if it wasn't met through the ballot box, then it would be met through appointment. So we looked at that, the speaker, the clerk and I, and said, is there a lesson here for the Northwest Territories? And so we thought that potentially there could be, although we knew that the idea of appointing people would be problematic, because this is a democracy, obviously, and people want to choose their representatives at the ballot box. So what we did was we went through a series of steps. So the first was on International Women's Day in 2018, I put forward a motion that the Legislative Assembly create a special committee to increase women's representation, and that we set targets of women's representation for 20% in 2019, 30% in 2023, 40% in 2027, and so on. Very modest goals. So the Assembly voted in favor of creating this special committee, and I was appointed to be the chair, and the regular members and the woman who's now the Premier, Carolyn Cochrane, we were members of this committee, and we toured around the NWT talking about how to increase the representation of women. And it was mostly women who came out to the meetings, and they were interested in our personal stories, mine and Caroline's, about how we had got into politics. And it was almost like, we have a real life politician here. We got to ask her questions about how did she do this and how could I do this? So it was a tour to look at systemic barriers, but unabashedly, it was a recruitment tour where if women showed up, we were happy to talk to them till midnight about how we did it and how they could do it and so on and so forth. So we ended up going to 12 communities, and we heard from, I'm going to say 30 or 40 women, and they identified a number of barriers, which I think women everywhere would be aware of. For example, the Legislative Assembly was not a family-friendly place to work. I had the embarrassing experience of telling a woman with a baby in arms that the only place she could change her baby was on the bathroom floor, or any other floor she wanted, but there was nowhere else to change the baby. We didn't really have a strong system of campaign schools, and women indicated that they would find that useful. They also talked about the possibility of having maternity leave or parental leave, and not just for women, but for men as well. They talked about how they were going to afford their campaigns, and could we create a scheme where they would be reimbursed if they earned a certain percentage of the vote. So there were 7 or 8 recommendations there, and they were all adopted by the Legislative Assembly. So that was the short-term piece of how do we attract women into this role by providing them with some specific supports. The second report dealt with quotas. And sure enough, it was extremely controversial, but we put forward, again, the same quota system that I described earlier of increasing 10% each election over a period of years. And that report was accepted as, we will look at this if we can improve things right now in the next election through the electoral process that we already have, and given the focus on this topic and the effort putting into talking to women. So in 2019, I offered a campaign school myself. And the Premier and I had done a bunch of campaign schools in the communities with the Status of Women Council, but I decided that I wanted to do my own thing because I had my own take on what was helpful to me. And the Premier came to support me and talk about her own experience. She always says, Julie and I did it differently, and she did it right. And I always say to her, well, that's not true. You got elected both times. So we did it differently. That is a fact. There's more than one way to get to where you're going there. So anyway, this campaign school attracted quite a bit of interest. I think we had around 12 or 15 participants. And I have to say, everybody who came to the campaign school and wanted to run was elected. So that was a pretty amazing result. I have to say that certainly exceeded anything in my expectation or experience. So at the end of the 2019 election cycle, we ended up with 9 women out of 19 members, and that included Carolyn and I returning. It included an engineer, civil servants, a nurse, a lawyer. It was very diverse, but the best thing of all was, of these 7 new women who joined the Ledge, more than half were Indigenous, which meant that we were still maintaining Indigenous representation, which has always been skewed towards Indigenous people. We were maintaining that with the new recruits. And what was also really inspiring was that communities that had never had a woman representative, didn't even have a woman chief at any time, brought women into the Legislative Assembly. So it was certainly an inspiring moment, I think, for all of us who were there, to look around and see all these women, to see that they represented the length and width of the NWT, with their own, their own, what can I say, skills, attributes. Yeah. So that's how it came about. And it was very gratifying. Of course, if only one more woman had been elected, I might be singing a different song, but it was really good. Now, how we got to 10 was, we had a by-election where, again, a woman ran in a place that didn't have women chiefs and had never had a woman representative, and she won there. So that's how we ended up then with 10 out of 19. And the executive council is 5 out of 7 women. And the commissioner is a woman. And yeah, women really are commissioners, like a lieutenant governor. So women now have a very visible presence in the Legislative Assembly.
That's incredible. And, as you were talking, every time I hear these stories, I get goosebumps, and just, it's so inspiring to hear the path, the concrete steps, the tangible pieces that actually made the difference, in your leadership, in showing up in these ways, and, just making sure that this was work that got done. I'm curious, you have this gender balanced legislature. Can you talk about what difference it's made to have that gender balance in terms of how you govern, and what that experience is like, and how other forms of diversity are reflected in how you do business?
Yeah. I guess I would say there are a couple of things. One is the way we do business, and the other is more about the outcomes. So I generally find that women are better listeners and more inclined to collaboration, and less about the power and wielding it. Now, that's a huge generalization. I want to own that, but that's generally what I've seen. And the Premier has created new forums for discussion with Indigenous governments, such as the NWT Council of Leaders, which has really taken off as a place to address key issues facing all residents of the NWT. So instead of having consultation with Indigenous governments afterwards, Indigenous governments are at the table. And so I find that is the future. That is the future. There's not going to be in the NWT, where the Indigenous population is more than 50%, that there's going to be an us and them. There needs to be all of us together. So the process has been more collaborative. In terms of motions, so motions are a way of putting subject matter onto the radar of the Legislative Assembly. So a motion usually has a preamble and some direction to the government. It's forwarded usually by a regular member, and then followed up with a seconder. And then there's some kind of response, usually comprehensive response provided. So of the 9 motions that were not just about statutory issues, 4 of them were about housing. And I think that that really speaks to the influence that women have had. All of these motions came from women. So they were things such as rent controls, using a reconciliatory approach to collecting public housing rents. We have a lot of public housing in the NWT in the small communities, directing people into home ownership, and looking at how to build more houses and make sure that the houses we have are in better shape. And so, as well as that, there was a motion on suicide prevention, food security, assistance for seniors, and reviewing policies to ensure that they were culturally safe and anti-racist across government. So arguably, any of these issues could have been raised by men, but the fact is they weren't. There was one housing motion in the 18th Assembly, and it was my motion. So I feel that the social envelope issues have had more priority, but not at the expense of other issues. We are engaged with business development, with financial management, with building roads and hospitals, all the things that any other government would do. But I feel that having this large cohort of women has really given profile to the social envelope issues that hasn't been present before.
That's, I mean, I love that you also reflected on, government as all of these pieces, those infrastructure, the hard infrastructure and the soft infrastructure, and that whole portfolio, and having that lens and the different experiences means that you're asking different questions and coming at it a bit differently. There's so much wisdom in the ways that you're working. And of course, in the South or in municipal governments, there are not the party apparatus. Do you have any reflections or commentary on that as something that, we might want to consider as a practice, or something that helps in the work up there in the NWT? Like any comments on that?
Well, I think having a consensus government really made this possible. And I say that because each person decides to run and then creates a platform, gets people to help, raises the money, which is very modest in the NWT. The most you can spend is $30,000. But some people spend close to that amount, because only about a third of our communities have roads. So there's a lot of flying around that needs to be done during the campaign period. But I think that because each person doesn't need to be endorsed by a party or steered into a particular riding that's advantageous to the party, or, checks a box for a female candidate, but she's placed in a riding that she's not likely to win because the incumbent is very strong or the party allegiance is very strong. I think consensus government really makes that possible. And, I'd say even to do with the election last night in Toronto, I just wonder if Olivia Chow had ran as an NDP, if she would have run that, if she would have won that, because the NDP is not strongly represented in Toronto. The Liberals are strongly represented in Toronto. So it seems that the lack of a party affiliation formal in the election might have been to her benefit. So, is the whole country ready to go on to consensus government? Well, no, they probably aren't. But I would say that municipal politics, although this wasn't my path, municipal politics are a good way to develop a platform, a following, some of the essential tools for being elected at any level.
Thanks. And I will note that in Toronto, provincially, there are a number of NDP MPPs. So there is a Toronto.
Okay.
But that's, it's
okay. Yeah, I made the wrong assumption there. I thought that it was every person for themselves. Okay.
So when you think about some of the things that you have learned in your work, do you have any suggestions for what other governments, other levels of governments might do to address the underrepresentation of women and other groups? Like, you know, you talked about some of the practices that worked really well for you, but do you have any advice to other organizations and governments on what they could be doing to see that huge jump and improvement in representation?
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of progress in making legislatures more amenable to having women, and yet the number of women elected really hasn't changed. So the barriers are obviously not the fact that there's no change room. The barrier is more to do with women's confidence. I find that you know, women question a lot whether they have the ability and the skills to become politicians, and the answer is yes. Like, the variety of people who become politicians is quite diverse, at least in the North. And so yes. So it really is about developing that confidence and helping people to develop that confidence. And the campaign schools were a way to do that, but I think also mentorship. You know, that's my role in this election coming up in October, is more mentoring people if they have specific questions to come to me, and you know, I'll share my communications plan, my fundraising plan, whatever it is that they need. I think that mentorship really helps. The other thing that seemed to really help last time was we had a group of 3 women who knew one another from being at residential schools together. And there was this sort of aha moment of, well, if you can do it, I can do it, because I know where you came from. I came from the same place. So that really seemed to galvanize a group of women to run, and they were successful in running. But it was almost like they needed to know that people like them belonged. And so, like them meaning Indigenous women, small communities, residential school survivors, that they could identify with one another, which gave them a lot of confidence, and different than anything that I could impart to them as somebody who is a settler, been in the Northwest Territories for 23 years. My story is not their story. They needed to identify someone with their story.
That story about the 3 Indigenous women who were schoolmates together in residential school is so incredibly powerful, and to then see them serve in the legislature is so incredible. In terms of a kind of suggestion, is there a practice or one thing that you think that other decision makers need to take on to help them with their equity and representation goals? Like one practice or approach that makes a lot of sense for you?
Well, I think making a commitment to increasing women's representation and backing that up with a plan, not just we want there to be gender parity here, but that we are going to put in place the optimal circumstances for making that happen, and to be accountable for that. And so, you know, great, we want 30% women. Well, we've got 30% women now. That's not a realistic target, but 40% women, which equals whatever number of seats in the particular legislatures. And then having all of the parties commit to that they will do that by encouraging women to run. So, I mean, that really is the baseline. If women don't run, they don't get elected. So the baseline is committing to a certain number of women who they will recruit or who will identify themselves as candidates, and to really hold themselves accountable for that, and to put in place the best circumstances for them succeeding, which is campaign schools, maybe financial help, maybe organizational help. Those are the things that will make a difference. Mentorship, you know, can you find a retired woman politician in your party who can go one-on-one with this woman who is thinking about running for the first time, available very widely to answer questions, to provide whatever kind of support the woman is asking for. So it has to be deliberate. Like we've tried the let go and let God approach, and it's only taken us so far. So I think that more deliberate targets with more deliberate supports are what are required to bring that up. And the supports include campaign schools. And I want to acknowledge, Chi, that you came here to do a campaign school, which I think was very well received. And so, Equal Voice has certainly been very important by providing the campaign schools both in person and online. And it's a way for women to understand what the job is and to build up their confidence that they have what it takes.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's important to recognize about those campaign schools is that not everyone who does campaign school is necessarily going to put their name on the ballot, but they may get involved in a campaign and through that, be a really important, play a really important role in community building and shaping and changing the face of political culture. So, candidate campaign school may not be for everyone, but there's a ton of leadership skills that come alongside doing that content and those kinds of learnings. I want to ask, you happen to have landed at a time in government in 2015 when you had a speaker and a clerk who was receptive to doing some systemic change work, in early days of Me Too, et cetera. Do you have any advice on how others may take on that systemic challenge work, that culture change work, knowing that many political institutions have histories, have foundations, for instance, the House of Commons has a dress code for the male MPs. You have to wear a suit and tie on the floor. But if you want to do that disruption work, if you want to think about politics differently, any advice on how you find your people to do that work?
Yeah. Well, I have to tell you that in the Northwest Territories, both the speaker and the clerk had daughters, and they only had daughters. And so it was like, well, they wouldn't be very welcome as things stand here now. So how can that be changed? I think that you're going to find speakers have good intentions and clerks want to help the speakers. That certainly was true here. The Commonwealth Women Parliamentarians, that was a very good networking group for me when I started off. So I think, appealing to their heads and their hearts that this is a project that is worth doing. It will bring great rewards to the government, to governance, to the Legislative Assembly or Parliament, wherever you're working. That there's an important role for women, and I don't think anyone would seriously argue against that in this day and age. They might not be super helpful, but I think that there are women clerks and women speakers who may be a good place to start. I think of my friend in Manitoba, Myrna Dreger, who's been the speaker there for a long time, and Pat Chachuk, who is the clerk. Two excellent women to get to know if you're in Manitoba, who can really be helpful in supporting women in politics. So I think you just have to gauge your situation, but most of all, don't be afraid to ask. Like, they won't do it if you don't ask. Likely they won't do it if you don't ask. But if you go to them and say, look, we've got this systemic problem, we can't get above 30% representation for women. It's time for women to be represented in equal numbers. And I'd be surprised if that didn't interest them. And where is it on the order paper? I'm not sure about that, but it would be worth asking. It's kind of like, if you don't run, you won't get elected. If you don't ask them to do something about it, they are not likely to volunteer.
Yeah, I've been remarking and reflecting on last night's election in Toronto. I'm obviously in Toronto right now, and the fact that the last two, the two front runners were two women, and between the two of them, they took about 72% of the vote. So wow. Tons of support. And if you took the top 7 candidates, of course, there's 102 candidates in this very messy mayoral race. They had over 75% of the vote for women, and 4 of them, 3 of them women of color, and 2 of them immigrants. Like it's where political leadership is starting to shift and look a bit different, and that's really exciting for me.
Yeah, I think that's our next challenge here, Chi, is to Yellowknife has become a very diverse community through immigration, and yet the Legislative Assembly has Indigenous people and Caucasian people and not anyone else. And so it's time for us to really look at that. I'm working with the chapter chair of Black Up North, the Black Lives Matter movement. It would be so exciting for him to be elected this time, a Black man, an immigrant. But even to run, I don't think a Black person has ever run in the NWT. So this would be a great step forward anyways, whatever the outcome.
Thank you, Minister Green. I can see that there's a couple questions in the Q&A, so I'm going to turn to that. We'll take a couple questions from the room. Thanks, folks, for adding them in. So the first question is from Dennis, who's interested in hearing more about the importance of mentorship and supporting folks in building their own confidence, especially for minority groups who are kind of moving into leadership. If you can reflect a little bit on that.
Yeah, well, I think what I've experienced with women is that they don't think they have the skills, but in fact, it's not that you need a degree in political science or a law degree or whatever, but more a skill set that has to do with good communications, written and oral, good ideas, willing to collaborate. So I think that highlighting those skills, if you're mentoring someone or you're in a campaign school with someone, so that it generalizes what's required rather than makes it super specific. I'm not a lawyer, so therefore I can't be a politician. I think that's really helpful. And then really listening to what they think the barriers are. Like, are you concerned about being away from home as often as you will be to be an elected politician at the provincial or territorial level? What can we do to help you with that? Are you concerned about your children, whether they should come in to the place you're working or whether they should stay home with the rest of their family? So I think it's important to listen to those concerns and talk about how other women in a similar situation have managed to try and raise children while being in politics. Really, the first time that's happened in our legislature is this session, where we have 2 women with young children, and that's really been an issue. And we've made some accommodations that have been really quite easy. For example, we have designated a night that is our late sitting night, and they know they need childcare for that night, and we know, the rest of us know, that telling them at 5 o'clock we're going to sit until 9 is not going to work for them. So I think listening to what those women who may or may not have young children, but what do they think of as the barriers, and trying to relate to that and do some troubleshooting around that.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think that through conversations with mentors, et cetera, is a really powerful way to get some of the insights and think about the opportunities to lead in those ways. Another question we have is sort of more broadly about women in the workplace. Wondering if they're, and of course you can speak to the political context that you're operating in, but what are some of the issues that you're seeing that are affecting women in the workplace and forecasting into the next few years? Is there anything that you see on the landscape or horizon that you want to share?
Specific to women, as I mentioned, childcare is certainly one of them. I think that certainly in this day and age, there's a lot of negativity through social media. When I go to federal, provincial, territorial meetings, I almost always talk about the other women, talk to the other women there about how they manage their social media. And a lot of people have staff managing it so that they're not exposed. it can be very toxic, and it's not that it isn't toxic for men, but it seems especially toxic for women. Like I think about everything that Catherine McKenna went through while she was an MP, and I can't think of a male equivalent to that. So that certainly is an issue that people need to work through. How are you going to deal with this? There's an expectation that we're all going to be available on social media, but how much of that are you going to do yourself, like reading all the comments and so on? That's been an issue. I think the schedule is a bit of an issue. It's a really full-time job most of the time. And so for people coming out of more regular employment, I think that they're sometimes taken aback by the demands, and in the Northwest Territories and probably in other places too, lots of travel with committees and with legislation. So, you know, in the Northwest Territories, that means getting on a small plane and sleeping on someone's couch. So, you know, that's, I guess, something that women may struggle with. We have a very good sexual harassment policy in the NWT. So I'm not aware that has been tested, but it was revised last term when I was a regular member. So I haven't heard of women having sexual harassment issues, but you know, there's no question that could be a dimension of anyone's work life, and knowing what the process is for resolving that is really important. So, yeah, it's challenging. I think you have to really be sure about your motivations and what you're hoping to accomplish to get you through some days that just seem never to end.
Yeah, it's a huge role to take on, to serve in public office. It's a huge public facing role.
Yeah.
Alongside politics, though, you know, people who are journalists, etc., also probably find themselves in a position where they may be open to critiques. There is a kind of form of online harassment, etc., that is a notable part of the job. And I think as Canadians everywhere, we have a role in kind of, you know, calling people out when they do that, reminding each other to be kind, you know, that this isn't actually helping to move a discussion and a debate along. So as you know, as Canadians who see and witness this online or in person, we have a role as bystanders too in terms of stepping in. I had one last question about campaign schools, you know, kind of what they are. Do you want to describe in a nutshell how you've been doing them in the NWT, and we can talk a little bit about what Equal Voice has been doing as well.
Sure. So in the NWT, we have now what we have is units online that people can work through individually, but they are also delivered in person with the same content, but with an instructor present and the ability for people to interact with one another. So probably that's more effective than the simple online. The way that I was doing it, there were kind of 6 modules, and the new campaign school is not that different. Looking at why are you running, public speaking, fundraising, communications, and campaigning, including, you know, when to do certain tasks and being ready for the campaign period, which is 4 weeks in the NWT, so it's relatively short. So that's the big benefit of campaign schools is hopefully it's a place that is non-judgmental for people to ask questions about anything that comes to mind. How much do you get paid? Do you ever get a holiday? What am I going to do about my children? What was the issue you campaigned on? You know, like women, probably more than women, but women in this case particularly need a safe space to ask those questions that people may think are self-evident, but they're not. And so just ask the question and be more informed about what you're getting into. And the reality is, with our wages for MLAs in the Northwest Territories, they're less than the professionals could make. The people who were working in professions, they're earning less money now than they have since they probably started their careers, but that isn't a reason not to do it. So I think it's really important to talk about the rewards. I mean, there are plenty of issues to talk about, but there are really rewards as well of changing things that you were told couldn't be changed, and lo and behold, they have been changed. So yeah, but I'd like you to throw it back to you. You know, you do more campaign schools now than anything I have to do with.
Yeah, no, certainly at Equal Voice, we've been running campaign schools for the last year. So we do an online version. We just ran a cohort, or just wrapping up a cohort this week. And then we also do in-person sort of 1 or 2 day sessions. And a lot of the topics that you covered there are the kinds of things that we cover as well. But really a huge part of that is building the community and a network of women and gender diverse folks who are curious and ready to step into politics, to see it as a potential professional pathway, and to think about the skills and the confidence required to step up to serve our communities. And that's a big framing for us as to how we do it. So you feel free to visit our website to take a look at our campaign school offerings, and the online modules that I think you've put together, I think are really great resource for all of Canada in terms of this conversation. So we're getting close to the end of our time together, Julie and Minister Green, and I wondered, you know, you are coming to the close of your term. You're thinking about legacy and what your aspirations, hopes are for the next incoming cohort of legislators, and how you think how you're actively working to kind of maintain gender balance and diversity.
Yeah, this is a big worry for me. Will we be able to maintain what we achieved? You know, it goes back again to women have to run to be elected. And so I've talked to women who have approached me independently, and I've also talked to some of the women who ran last time and weren't successful, and asked them if they would consider running again. So I'm trying to be proactive about this to try and maintain our successes. I think the hard thing is that we've been getting a lot of bad mouthing from the public about what we've accomplished in this term. The term where it was so many women, it was also the term of the pandemic. And so, you know, a lot of what I think we hoped to achieve was not achievable because we were consumed by this public health emergency, as was the entire world. But that's sort of being lumped in with women are ineffective. So I think that we have to really do a better job of telling our story. This is what we've achieved, and this is why it's important, and this is why we need to maintain it. So we have the opportunity in this legislature to make speeches under the orders of the day, which are kind of next to our cabinet roles. We don't have to talk about our cabinet assignment. We can talk about other things. So I'm planning an omnibus. It's called Reply to the Commissioner's Opening Address. So you can talk without any limitation in that time slot. So yeah, I'm really conscious of that, and asking people to, you know, approach their friends, their family, their, you know, their colleagues from different stages of their work lives to consider running. I think last year in one riding, there were 5 women running in one riding. So that's amazing. So, you know, if we can at least try to have a woman in most ridings, and maybe more than one. We've got quite a lot of incumbents running again. So of the 10 who were elected over the course of this assembly, only 2 of us are retiring. So we've got that incumbency as well. So yeah, I am working towards maintaining that. That's my ultimate goal. I just think it's possible, but I don't think we should take anything for granted.
And when is your election day? It's early October, am I remembering?
Yeah, it's October 2nd. Yeah.
Part of our work at Equal Voice is to take a look at legislatures and think about, what are the system changes? What can we recommend as practices that are going to make legislatures more gender inclusive and a better place for everyone, but particularly for women. So that's part of our suite of work, is like looking at family policies, advocating for fixed election dates, some of the things that allow people to actually plan for this job that is quite demanding and asks a lot of our leaders. So the last question before we close out. Do you have any summer reads that you'd like to share with us, that you'd like to leave us with, or any final advice on maintaining and keeping gender balance and diversity as forefront, both in the practice and the representation, but also in how you end up with strong practice and governance, etc.
Yeah, well, I just finished an awesome book, so I'll start with that. It's called Lady Tan's Circle of Women. It just came out this month by Lisa See, S-E-E. And this Lady Tan is a doctor in Ming era China, who wants to practice as a doctor in an era where women were really secluded, that is to say, wealthy women like she was, very secluded, and very impaired by the foot binding. And oh my God, thank God I wasn't born then. But anyway, she manages to practice as a doctor and write a book about her experiences. And that's a true story. So the book is not true, but the fact there was this Ming era doctor who had a circle of women who supported her in becoming a doctor. That's how she achieved things. So I hadn't thought about it until now, but yes, this is our story all over again. Yeah, so I think it's really important to consider that there is no prototype for a politician. I remember being on a panel of NWT politicians. 3 of us were immigrants. One was a person of color. That we have different kinds of education. That we have different goals for being here. That it really is wide open. There doesn't have to be a type, and you also don't have to do it at a certain age. The Premier and I are 6 weeks apart in age, and so we came to this game fairly late, in our mid-50s, and we overcame a lot of things in our lives, different things for each of us. But at the end, she, a Métis woman with a social work background, and me, a Caucasian woman with a broadcasting background, had ended up in housing nonprofits and were very inspired to do something about housing. So it can be anyone. There is no prototype. You have to fit into this box, and this is the only one that will do. They're really think big and get involved.
Thank you. That's such a great kind of rallying cry and call to action for each of us. I think we all have the opportunity to serve our communities in different ways. Some of us by putting our names on the ballot, some of us by doing other work, some of us by being part of great organizations that are addressing social issues. I did see one more question in the chat, so I'll take it quickly and then we'll begin to close out. The question is actually a practical one about how you pay for campaign expenses if you're not supported by a party. So what does that look like?
Oh, well, that's a good question. So my campaign fundraising method is to ask a lot of people for small amounts of money, and that has worked for me. They are tax receivable donations, so that sometimes incentivizes people to give. So in the Northwest Territories, you could give a maximum of $1,500. So I hit up my nearest and dearest for the maximum amount. And then I just canvassed my wide network of contacts and said, I'm putting in money of my own. I'm hoping you're going to help me. And this is like running itself. You have to ask that people probably aren't going to send you money just off the cuff. And of course, there are a lot of rules around who can give to and what they can give to and so on. That would be in your Elections Act. But yeah, asking is the best thing to do. And you know, I find that women are better at that. They are just generally more likely to ask. The disasters I saw in the election expense reports were men who were too proud to ask. So they were putting in tens of thousands of their own money. I was like, you know what? I'm sure people believed in you. You got elected. So why didn't you ask them for some money? So yeah, I mean, that's a whole topic of itself, but happy to talk more about that if people are interested. My career before I got elected was actually doing fundraising for nonprofits. I really believe they needed to raise their own money to be independent in their programming and not beholden to government contribution agreements solely. So yeah, just ask.
Yeah, you don't get anything if you don't ask. So
No.
that goes in terms of running for office, but also for raising the campaign funds to do so, and for many kinds of opportunities that
Yeah.
might be thinking about or considering. So we are just about at time. I want to thank people for joining in and signing in from across the country. I thank Minister Green for joining us today and sharing with us some incredible insights on some of the incredible work that's happening in the Northwest Territories. Thank you. Huge thanks to Igal for co-hosting us here. If you want to learn more about Igal's work, the 50-30 Challenge, there are links there in the chat. I know the session's being recorded, so for those who want to go back and like take furious notes, feel free to do that. I think that'll be circulated after. Thank you so much for your time today, and thanks for the great questions, and have a great rest of June and summer months, everyone. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you for hosting. Bye-bye.
Bye.